He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we are diving back into a few Sasquatch encounters. But before we do, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, X, Facebook, and YouTube. And should you wish to reach us directly, you can do so via cryptidclues@gmail.com. So let's get into this first encounter. Now, this first experience takes place in the Shasta National Forest, close to Mount Shasta itself. A few years ago, my mother actually took a spiritual trip out there with some friends. I could not tell you what that really entails, but the exception to that is that Shasta area is known for being a very spiritual place. It attracts many individuals just kind of seeking that kind of connection in their life. Now, we actually did an episode on Mount Shasta and its many cave networks, including some occult activities that have taken place there in the past, which again coincide with that spiritual attraction to this mysterious location. Now, this experience, however, is specific to the Mad River area that sits in Trinity County, California. And I quote, "When I was 35, I went to visit my brother who was living near the Mad River in California. We decided to go out deer hunting in the Trinity Shasta National Forest, an area dense with ferns and pine trees. In the late afternoon, we left the truck and walked down a 4x4 trail. We decided to split up. My brother continued down the trail while I chose to set up on a hairpin turn above a creek bed. The woods were eerily silent. After about 20 minutes, I felt a strong sense of unease, as if something was watching me from the ferns and trees. I frequently glanced behind me, but saw nothing. Then, without warning, a large rock weighing roughly 30 pounds was just suddenly thrown into the creek bed below with a loud crash. The creek was only about 20 yards away, and the noise was terrifying. Once again, silence just fell over the forest. Frightened, I decided to head back to the truck, wondering if my brother might be playing a prank. I waited there for around 40 minutes before he finally arrived. I mentioned the incident, but he was confused and said he had no idea what I was talking about. As he had been hunting half a mile away, now, having hunted in California, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, and New York since 1975, I can say this was the creepiest experience I've ever had. I believe it might have been a Sasquatch that threw the rock, possibly even aiming it over my head into the creek bed." End quote. Now, this is a sudden act with no visual confirmation of anything. Now, I still like to remind everyone that while it may not be called a sixth sense, if you are being watched by someone within proximity to you, I firmly believe that there is a high chance you'll just know. If you look around, you'll probably spot someone watching you. Ultimately, there isn't any scientific evidence to confirm such a thing, but there is a name for it: the psychic staring effect, also sometimes called scopaesthesia. Now, it's the ability to detect when being stared at. And this idea was first explored by a psychologist named Edward B. Tishner. That was in 1898, after students in his junior classes started to report that they were being able to feel when somebody was looking at them, even though they could not see this person. This was stemming from them being in the class and feeling that the people behind them were staring at them by looking at the back of their heads. From this, however, Edward began actually performing laboratory experiments, nothing Frankenstein related, as much as that sounds like it. It was ultimately just basic level things that concluded in negative results. But the topic has still been a subject of discussion ever since, up to the present day. Now, one thing of note I found interesting here regarding Edward's studies was that After rejecting the telepathic possibility, he then suggested that when a subject experienced the feeling that they were being watched, now hypothetically here, let's say they were not being watched. Now bear with me. So the person is not being watched, but they turn around to check because they feel like they're being watched. A second person who is behind them, who already had that person in their field of vision, might then notice the subject starting to turn their head around, and then their own head would suddenly shift their gaze to the subject. Now, to quote my favorite movie, their vision is based on movement. We're animals, predatory, so when we see movement, it makes sense that it catches our gaze. So obviously, what their explanation here is that when the subject feels like they're being watched, they turn around to see who is looking at them, and you might just be staring off into the distance, but this person is in your field of vision. You see their head turn around, and you just look and lock eyes at them, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, the person that was the subject who felt like they were being watched, they feel vindicated and justified that, oh, I really can feel it, that I'm being watched. It's just an interesting concept to think about when we're looking at this. Now, it may not be telepathic, and maybe it is just fluke like that, but I mean, you just get a random feeling, you turn around and someone else turns to you, but maybe there is still something there that we just haven't found. Now, since you are still in the second person's field of vision when you get the feeling, maybe that's what people experience when Sasquatch has them in their sights. And so when I say that, maybe it is just Sasquatch just kind of observing and looking around, but then people are like, oh, you know what, like we had a whiff of like movement behind them when they turn and look. Like there's so many different possibilities when it comes to Sasquatch, and that's a whole rabbit hole in itself, and me being very hypothetical. But let's move on to our next two encounters, both taking place within Lane County, Oregon. And I quote, 1975, Salt Creek Falls. Now, this happened 30 years ago at the age of 5, while camping with my sister and parents at Salt Creek Falls, Oregon, on Highway 58, just past the tunnel. A large being sat down in our campsite and ate some chicken out of the bucket we left out. This was in the middle of the night. My parents were sleeping in a nearby tent, and my sister and I were on the cots out in the open. As I said, I was 5 years old, and my sister was 10. The next morning, my sister and I were out exploring and playing on the lava flows. Something scared my sister, and she pushed me down and ran. I suffered a gash to the side of my head, and someone or something picked me up and carried me like a baby. He or it carried me back to the campsite and placed me on my cot. My parents weren't there, and when they came back from looking for me, they asked me how I found my way back. I told them a bear carried me back. I told them that he or it walked, carrying me in its arms, and I remember that it was all hairy and wore no clothes. It looked like the same thing that was eating the chickens the night before, and I haven't seen anything like this since. End quote. Now, this is a steep story, but let's just sit back and break it down a little bit. All we have is other reports to help connect some dots here. The first dot being Sasquatch having an interest with kids. It's a whole rabbit hole in itself because we could connect religion or a plethora of other things to why Sasquatch are drawn to children. But for now, we'll just stick with the fact that Sasquatch are drawn to them. Dot number 2, if you have watched the Missing 411 movies, then you will also be aware that children and sometimes grown-ups, but their bodies will be either found miles from where they went missing, or they'll just have no proper explanation as to why or how they managed to cover so much ground on their own. Now, it's not a confirmation, but hypothetically, are the bodies being moved? If we're to believe this, we can always look at the Albert Ostman experience, where he was asleep in his sleep sack and claimed something picked him up, abducted him, and he had several days pass before managing to escape from them being a family of Sasquatch. The last dot, which is kind of like a 3-in-1, the bigger sister got scared and would have reiterated that she saw something and was frightened. Not all Sasquatch are bad. Some just observe, and some reports also have a bit of a positive spin to them. This is actually a lot of the earlier ones that I remember reading about when I was a kid were Sasquatch encounters that were mostly positive experiences. Now, this doesn't mean bad ones are not out there. Look at our first encounter of the show. Not good at all. If it did prove to be a Sasquatch and had negative intentions, rock throwing can be a very, very dangerous thing. But I do believe, like anything, you have good and bad. Not to mention that if you left chicken out, then the big guy probably felt like he was making a trade, or you guys were friendly, and it was just a gesture of kindness, which is another rabbit hole on their self-conscious and intelligence, but I'll save that for another day. So I do think there's a strong possibility here, not to mention Oregon is the Pacific Northwest. I don't have to add much to that because it is absolutely filled with reports, but the idea that one of these things could have picked up this child knowing that it was injured, brought the child back to its cot. And I think the cot is a very specific note here where it was in the camp, it was sitting down, it was eating chicken from this bucket, and it took note that the children were in the cot, and that's where it thought, okay, this is a safe place. I can put the child back in the cot. If I was camping back in the day, and I know this is a different time, I would not feel comfortable being in a tent with my wife and leaving my 5-year-old and 10-year-old daughter outside on a cot, not in a tent. Different time, different era. I totally get that. But man, I would just be terrified though, thinking like, what if a bear or a cougar were to come up there? Like, you guys are in the tent with me. No ifs, ands, or buts. But that is just who I am as a father. Now, I digress. As mentioned before, we're staying in Lane County, Oregon. We're going to just jump ahead 10 years to 1988. Sorry, a little over 10 years to be precise. And I quote, "My partner and I were deer hunting near Diamond Peak Wilderness area, south of Highway 58, near the Cascade Summit in Oregon. It was the second weekend of the season in 1988, and we had a small travel trailer to stay in. We arrived at our camp spot almost at midnight on Friday. It was about 2 a.m. when we finally got settled down and hit the sack. My partner was asleep almost immediately, as I could hear him snoring faintly every so often. And even though I was dead tired, my head was going 100 miles per hour after the long day that we had. And as I was laying there thinking about what I might have forgotten, I started to hear a thumping noise in the distance. It came from the south of us towards the wilderness area. At first I thought it might be some other hunters setting up camp, but I heard no other noises, and it was a strange sound, like dropping a heavy object onto the hard ground. Eventually, it faded out, and I fell asleep. The next morning, we drove down the road we had come in on and stopped by a small creek. My partner had done some scouting in the area sometime before and said that this should be a good place to hunt. With only about 3 hours of sleep, I didn't care. I said okay, and we split up with about 30 yards between us as we worked our way down the creek, losing sight of each other occasionally because of the brush. After about 2 hours, I lost sight of him for quite some time. Began to call his name in a very low tone. I did not get an answer from him, so I started looking around. After a short time, I found him sound asleep against a tree stump with his rifle across his legs. As tired as we were, I couldn't really blame him and decided to wander around on my own for a little while. I followed the creek on down for about another hour when the brush became so dense I could go no farther. I made a hard left turn, and about 30 yards later it came to a dirt bank about 10 feet high. It was pretty steep, and as I approached it, I saw some depressions going up it. I went up beside them, but didn't really pay much attention until I got to the top. The last depression was not just a depression, but a huge footprint, or at least half a footprint. From the toes to the ball of the foot, it was huge, about 7.5 inches across at the widest point. It was also clear enough to tell which foot. It was the right one, and it had 5 toes. I thought for a moment, and then looked for more prints, but the bush was just too thick. I wondered why only half a print, and then it dawned on me that when you go up a steep bank, you don't walk on the whole foot. You use the toes and the ball of the foot as if you're taking steps. I did not have a camera with me at the time, and the only other thing I could remember is that it was about 2.5 times deeper than my prints, and I weighed 200 pounds. Realizing how late it was, I started to get back to where my partner was, and he was still asleep when I arrived. I woke him up and we headed back to our vehicle. Now, I never told him because he is a non-believer when it comes to that sort of stuff. He told me some years before that it's all BS. Now, nothing else happened the rest of our time there, and I have never been back to that spot since, but would like to go someday. A few years later, I actually read in the local paper that some hunters in that same area reported strange screams late in the day. End quote. Now, this experience doesn't confirm the sounds as tree knocks, and even if it did, we still don't know what tree knocks mean. But hypothetically, let's say it's an alert form of communication. Non-hypothetically, in fact, now my favorite recent research study shows that chimpanzees in a Uganda rainforest to be precise, actually communicated by banging on tree roots. Now, after scientists were analyzing everything, it appeared some chimps had actually formed certain identity knocks, warning knocks, and a plethora of other different calls that they could do. Now, Reuben and I did an episode on this that was very in-depth. It's available on our feeds. It was really, really fascinating to look into that form of communication. But let's say in this case, that's exactly what happened. Maybe when they arrived late at night while these creatures were out, as we know that they can be very, very active at nighttime, the individuals heard these strange sounds when trying to fall asleep because they were trying to alert and clear the area. They have no idea what the humans' goals are, but they know enough to feel threatened and when to move. So the fact that they were hunting and not just camping, meaning that they were going to go out a few hours from their base camp and start spreading around, maybe that's something that Sasquatch would be able to intelligently factor in. But ultimately, it wouldn't know, per se, how far it needs to go. Or I imagine maybe it would have someone stay behind to monitor while the rest of the group is running away. The fact that she found tracks very far away tells me, though, that they were leaving either for good, I don't know, or just retreating, watching them from a distance, but they were trying to clear the area. I'm sure there could be more possibilities, of course, but the idea that they were leaving and they were possibly using the sounds to alert others in the area that, hey, humans appeared, we need to clear out, don't come back for a while. I just think that is a very, very logical concept. So that's just one of the conclusions that I've drawn from that encounter. But that's everything. So thank you for listening to this week's episode of Cryptid Clues. Now, we'll be back next week. I'm going to talk to Reuben and see what he's thinking about doing our top 5 cryptids discussion, our starting points and where we're at now, and just where we feel that things are at this level with new information and just new discussions after we've learned so much and talked about so much in this community about cryptids. So stay tuned for that. We'll see if I can snag him for next week's episode. If not, sometime this month, I'm sure. I digress. Until then, you can check us out on our social medias, X, YouTube, Facebook, and find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. If you have anything you'd like to share or just say hello, you can reach us at CryptidClues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.